We are 10 days into case number 004-2026, the impeachment trial of Vice President Sara Zimmerman Duterte. In this setting, the Senate of the Philippines is formally sitting as an impeachment court. Senate President Win Gatchalian and presiding officer Chiz Escudero oversee a chamber where political figures are transformed into judges. The respondent, Vice President Duterte, faces the potential of permanent removal from her office, the highest stakes possible in a constitutional democracy. The room functions like a criminal court, but the legal architecture is distinct. While the aesthetic is judicial, the rules of procedure are designed to be flexible, accommodating the unique requirements of a political trial. This flexibility is tested as NBI Director Melvin Matibag takes the witness stand. His testimony introduces a specific challenge. The prosecution is relying on investigative findings that move beyond traditional courtroom evidence. An impeachment trial operates at the intersection of law and politics. Case 004-2026 is a study in how these two realms attempt to find common ground when defining what counts as proof of a constitutional violation. To construct their case, the NBI has submitted a 15-year-old video of a demolition, unverified news clippings, and an unsigned affidavit. The defense objects to these items immediately. Under strict criminal procedure, these are out-of-court statements being used to prove a point, legally defined as inadmissible hearsay. Director Matibag responds by framing these documents not as direct evidence of a specific felony, but as components of an open-source intelligence threat assessment. OSINT, or Open Source Intelligence, is the practice of gathering publicly available data to map out networks, establish capacities, and evaluate potential dangers before they materialize. In this proceeding, the prosecution is utilizing hearsay to establish a pattern of behavior rather than a statutory crime. They are arguing that these materials prove a direct breach of constitutional duty. This evidentiary duality informs the tactical maneuvers seen throughout the trial. It determines how the NBI builds its narrative and how the defense attempts to dismantle it. Defense counsel Mark Vinluan begins his cross-examination by questioning the NBI's jurisdiction, specifically the creation of the Special Task Force under Administrative Order 11. Vinluan highlights a procedural requirement. A subpoena must name a specific, defined felony to be legally enforceable against a target. The NBI's investigation currently lacks this. Because they have not yet identified the individual the vice president reportedly talked to, they cannot issue a subpoena naming a specific criminal actor. Director Matibag shifts his defense to Republic Act 10867. He argues the NBI's primary mandate is the protection of the state and the security of the president. Matibag interprets this law as a directive to be proactive. In his view, the Bureau is required to investigate potential threats to national stability before a crime is executed. This pivot allows the NBI to move past strict subpoena requirements. By defining their work as a threat assessment rather than a typical criminal inquiry, they justify their continued investigation into the vice president's public statements. The most significant clash over evidence involves an affidavit attributed to Arturo Las Cañas, a self-confessed former hitman. Counsel Vinluan points out that the document is unsigned and unnotarized. He argues that without the author's signature, the document has no legal standing. Senator Judge Panfilo Locsin intervenes with historical context. He notes that Las Cañas had previously retracted his testimony before the Senate, leading his committee to recommend a perjury charge. To the defense, the document is a mere scrap of paper. They argue it is unreliable, and its inclusion in the trial is deeply prejudicial. Presiding Officer Escudero admits the document, but with a specific legal qualification. The affidavit is not admitted as proof that its contents are true. Instead, it is accepted solely as evidence of the materials the NBI considered while conducting its open-source investigation. This ruling illustrates a fundamental mechanic of political trials. A document's existence can be used to justify an investigator's methodology, even if the document's contents would be excluded from a criminal trial as hearsay. The NBI uses these materials to build a theory of what they call a kinetic force, a tangible threat generated by public rhetoric and political dissent. To prove the vice president is capable of executing such a threat, they cite a 2011 video where she struck a court sheriff during a demolition. In a standard court, using 15-year-old prior bad acts to prove current intent is generally prohibited. The NBI bypasses this by integrating the 2011 video with more recent public statements to satisfy what they call a 5-factor threat assessment. This diagram shows law enforcement clustering isolated events. Connecting the 2011 incident with the 2024 press conference creates a unified capability theory. This doesn't prove a specific crime occurred. It proves the respondent possesses the historical behavior and current capacity to carry out a threat. Intelligence agencies rely on this pattern of violence modeling when direct actionable evidence, like the specific identity of a hired assassin, remains unidentified. Senator Judge Tolfo challenges the NBI on what he describes as a double standard in their investigative tactics. Tolfo points to ordinary citizens, teachers and construction workers, who have been arrested without warrants for making online threats against the president. He contrasts these rapid arrests with the NBI's slow, multi-month case buildup involving the vice president. Director Matibog defends the discrepancy, citing the difficulty of proving a conspiracy involving a high-ranking official and their extensive personal security network. The political status of the respondent influences the application of criminal procedure, shifting the state's response from immediate arrest to a long-term investigative buildup for impeachment. This leads to the NBI's core legal theory, which attempts to justify impeachment even without proof of a completed assassination plot. To prosecute a conspiracy in a criminal court, the state must prove an overt act was taken to execute the plan. In an impeachment court, the prosecution looks at the presidential oath of office, which requires the executive to execute the law and do justice. Director Matibog argues that the moment a vice president publicly admits to contracting a killer, she has violated that oath. According to this theory, the betrayal of public trust is consummated by the admission itself. Under this framework, whether the plot was ever executed is legally secondary. The constitutional violation is the public declaration of the intent to kill. Case 004-2026 highlights the differing standards between the criminal justice system and the constitutional process of impeachment. A criminal conviction leads to prison. A political conviction leads to removal from power. This difference in outcomes allows for a different standard of proof. The court moves away from the requirement of beyond a reasonable doubt and towards a finding of sufficient evidence of a breach of duty. The final verdict depends on whether the senator judges accept this paradigm, which values threat assessments and historical patterns as valid proof of a constitutional violation. Impeachment courts rely on open-source intelligence and historical patterns to ensure the protection of the state's integrity, even when a traditional criminal prosecution is not yet possible.